Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the panel discussion on how technology can be an enabler for good in the pursuit of sustainability. As we stand at the intersection of rapid technological advancements and pressing environmental challenges, the potential for tech to drive positive change has never been more evident. Today's conversation will explore the multifaceted ways in which tech innovations are not only addressing sustainability issues, but also creating a greener, more equitable future. From renewable energy solutions and smart agriculture to circular economy models and AI-driven conservation efforts, we'll delve into how tech is reshaping our approach to sustainability. Our esteemed panellists bring a wealth of knowledge and experience from diverse fields, and I'm looking forward to hearing their insights on how we can harness the power of tech to build a sustainability future. Together we'll examine the successes, challenges and future possibilities as a catalyst for environmental and social good. So let's embark on the important dialogue and uncover how we can leverage tech to create lasting positive impacts for our planet and future generations. Thank you. So first I'd like to introduce our esteemed panellists. On my left, Ritu Raj. Thank you, Ritu. Wave to the crowd. Global Head of Sustainability at Unilever. Unilever has long been a pioneer in sustainability with initiatives that span reducing plastic waste, improving water stewardship and enhancing agricultural sustainability. Rita will share how the company is harnessing tech to drive these and other initiatives forward and achieve their ambitious sustainability targets. David Coleman, Chief Product Officer at IOV42. Thank you, David. IOV42 is known for its innovative blockchain technology that ensures transparency, security and traceability in supply chains. David will discuss how their tech is being used to build trust and accountability in various industries, thereby supporting sustainable practices and ethical sourcing. And last but not least, Matt Andrew, Partner and General Manager at Ecometrics. Ecometrics specialises in data science and analytics, providing actionable insights that drive strategic decision-making. Matt will elaborate on how Gen AI and data analytics can be powerful tools in understanding and mitigating environmental impacts, optimizing resource use and crafting effective sustainability strategies. So thank you all. Let's give our panelists a warm welcome. Okay, let's start with one of the most significant challenges, measuring and reducing supply chain carbon emissions. Rita, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure.
Unilever has made significant strides in reducing its carbon footprint. Could you share your approach to measuring and reducing Scope 3 across your extensive supply chains?
Indeed. Unilever as a company has been on this journey for sustainability for more than a decade now, and we've been leading the industry in a number of ways. We recently came out with the Climate Transition Action Plan that went to our annual general meeting. It was overwhelmingly approved by the board and the general meeting there. And what we've identified through the whole process is, what is the materiality of carbon that sits within our supply chain? And it's predominantly Scope 3 emissions in the raw material and the packaging materials that we procure. So that's where our emissions sit. And for any company of our size and scale to become net zero, what it essentially means is all of our upstream supply chain needs to become net zero as well. So in order to do that, we have identified the areas which is most material from an overall carbon perspective, which includes things like how do we formulate better, how do we use ingredients which have a much lower environmental footprint, how do we ensure that our sourcing principles have a much lower environmental footprint in nature-based products, how do we ensure that there is zero deforestation caused by some of the ingredients that we use. Similarly, we're looking at some of the key chemical ingredients which we have in our supply chain as well. So we have a number of pillars in our Climate Transition Action Plan which identifies some of these levers. And towards that, the most material is how do we engage with our suppliers in their journey towards net zero as well. Like I said, we don't become net zero till our suppliers become net zero. And towards that, we have launched a very extensive supplier climate program through which we're engaging with our suppliers. And what we found there is that, with the diversity of suppliers that we have, there is a wide spectrum. Some of the biggest suppliers are as big as us, some are perhaps bigger than us as well, and they're as mature as we are, so they have a good understanding of what it takes. They have the technology, they have the resources needed to make it happen, and there we have predominantly how can we address it, how do we exchange the information at scale. So that's one of the biggest areas we're looking at with the top tier of suppliers. And then we have a large median, companies who want to work in this space, and we engaging with them. How do we help with some of our own experiences? How do we help with third-party solutions, technology, guidance, so that they can upskill and they can bring up their capabilities to improve what it takes to have carbon footprint metrics produced at scale within their organization. And then we also have a large bunch of suppliers who just getting started on this, and we need to be helping them improve their understanding of what does it take to, what does even carbon footprint mean, how can they do it at scale, and that's how we're approaching it pretty much. Yeah.
Thank you, Ritu. Matt, I saw you nodding there. How does the data analytics come into that Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, I think it's really important what Ritu was talking about, that there's a wide variety of maturity across suppliers. And when you're an organisation the size of Unilever, and we've done work with another FMCG in the UK, where some of those suppliers, that they just don't have the resource, they don't have the understanding of the sustainability directives and the regulations around that, and also companies like Unilever and other FMCGs and the companies that suppliers want to service are coming out with more and more complex kind of requirements and policy documentation and things like that. So one of the areas where tech can really support better understanding for companies like Unilever of their Scope 3 footprint from the suppliers that they use, but also to support suppliers in upskilling themselves, is one of the things that we've developed is called the supplier assistant, which is where we use generative AI approach to train the solution on the specific reporting requirements of the client, and also the wider CSRD, European Union regulations, etc. The supplier puts all their policy documents within that, any other materials that they have, their annual statement, any presentations, etc. And the assistant basically helps them match their documents to the different questionnaires of people they want to serve, and then allows on the client side for them to understand the maturity of their supplier base in terms of their own sustainable journey and evolution. So it lets them focus on specific areas where they need to support them to take better steps, or to increase their documentation, or to focus on areas to change suppliers where that change isn't happening quickly enough. So a really important way where tech can increase the visibility of Scope 3 footprint, but also close the gap, that maturity gap that Ritu was talking about. So that very broad range of much smaller suppliers are actually accelerated in their own transition to increase their sustainability initiatives.
Thank you, Matt. And David, how does blockchain fit into all of this?
Yeah. Blockchain on its own is never going to be the answer to anything. One of the most probably unsung things I would say about blockchain is that it forces companies to think cross-organisationally. And the problems we're talking about is their data problems, but where before decisions were made on the database within an organisation, now you're talking about needing to make decisions that sit across multiple organisations. And so blockchain is one of those potential, and it has a role to play, or can have a role to play. But really the overarching problem is, how do we collect the data? How do these different organizations collect the data? And then how does that data make its way to where it's really needed? So it's interesting, actually, looking at the panelists. We've got Ritu, who's that big organization that needs to make some really critical decisions and reporting on this data. You've got Matt, who is helping sort of analyze and process that data. And then you've got me, who's representing a company that's trying to help with the collection and dissemination of that data. And so blockchain is one of those technologies that certainly assists in it, but it's the overall need is how do there's so much data to be collected, there's so much data to be organized, there's so much data to be disseminated. So how can we help with that? And tech is not only is the real enabler for it. I think without it, it's too big a task. That we need the tech to make that happen.
If I were to just make a point around that tech as well, one of the biggest challenges, if you look at the supply chain in general, is many a times our suppliers or suppliers in general ask the question that if you ask for any additional piece of disclosure, one more questionnaire, it's like there is benefit for the company who's asking the question, but at many times some of the smaller suppliers, they don't have the resources and the capability to answer some of these complex questions, right? So at sometimes it's just about, there are 4 or 5 resources who are doing this across the organization, and the effort it will take to answer these questions is significantly higher. So it comes to them at a cost, and many times the question is, what's in it for us? And I strongly feel that tech can play a huge role in enabling this answering for the smaller suppliers particularly is in 2 ways. One is what's in it for us is the same supplier probably needs to answer 5, 6 of those questionnaires. They will be the same set of questions, probably with different flavors. I use this analogy that different companies ask for the same set of information. One is a PDF in a red font and size 12. Another company asks for an Excel sheet, and another one is just email, right? So just the job of converting the same set of metrics to different templates is so complex and time consuming, and I strongly believe tech can play a very big role in solving this problem. And in a way, this is the answer to the smaller companies that what's in it for us. Tech helps them reduce the time and effort and strengthens the robustness of the data and the disclosure that they need.
So do you find yourself with your peers in the industry talking about how this data gets collected, how to minimize the impact on the SMEs and smaller businesses in the supply chain to just kind of ease that burden?
Absolutely. And then, there's so many dimensions to the sustainability challenge. You have climate, water, waste, biodiversity, and it's increasingly becoming more and more minute. It's increasingly becoming more and more granular. So you need to ask a number of these questions. And one of the biggest way in which we could make progress and move the needle in this space is how do we standardize the way in which the data is essentially 3 dimensions of standardization. The first is the methodology in which you compute the metric, right? So people might be computing the same things in different ways, so they have their own bespoke formulas, so as to say, how do we standardize that, right? So that will solve the problem. Once you have done the calculation, how do you ensure that your output is in the same template so that when you send it out, it's easy for everyone to accept and digest and then use it further on. And the third bit to that is how do you make that exchange happen at pace and without friction? And I'll just share one of the best examples of my personal application where we, as Unilever, we've been doing it. The work we're doing with World Business Council for Sustainable Development on carbon footprint data exchange, we've solved exactly these 3 things. So, they've come up with the PACT, which is Partnership for Carbon Transparency. They do these 3 things. The methodology, they prescribe a methodology, but not a calculator. So you could use any tool to calculate as long as you're using it in that particular framework. And once your output is there, everyone uses the same schema. And then what we have with them is now an API that you could use to exchange information at scale. So I think standardization of data exchange is at the core of a number of these challenges, and the work that David, you doing, and Matt, yourself as well. How do you see standardization becoming more ingrained in your workflows as well?
So I mean, standardization is a big part of CSRD, right, in terms of the regulatory requirements anyway. And one of the things that's really important about that is even for mature organizations, for anyone that hasn't had the joy of submitting your own CSRD regulatory kind of documentation, there's 1,400 questions in the CSRD kind of documentation. Most of them are free text in some way to describe, and so that standardization is actually really critical to take all of the information that exists in very different levels of maturity around a business. Like you might have a lot of strong process and data capture in place within your procurement or supply chain. You might have really weak data around your marketing activities or your commercial and sales teams, for example. But still you want to kind of capture the full scope of that. And so one of the areas that tech plays a role in the work that we do is in, again, allowing a helper to make sure that you're just porting all of that documentation in whatever form. So less around standardizing the entry, but more around using the power of Gen AI to say that whatever the form the data takes, you're using a helper to basically pre-fill or find the most relevant information from all of those different sources to make sure that you're like filling and knowing across those 1,400 questions where are the gaps that you have, where are the places that you need to focus, and maybe it identifies, actually we need to dig into our secondary site freestanding display like calculations and materials and the suppliers that provide that, because we don't have a great visibility and coverage there. So for us, it's less about standardization of the output. It's more about how do you use tech to be able to translate what is a very wide variety and quality of data to make sure that you're still having the best reporting that can then lead to knowing the areas where you need to put the most focus to mitigate your climate impact.
Thank you, Matt. I can see that that immense scale of the 1,400 data points for a supply chain just becomes mind-boggling. So without the technology, it's difficult even to get your arms around all of that. Another area I think you touched on earlier, Matt, but perhaps, David, this is a question for you around the European Union deforestation regulation, so the EUDR, which I know is on the top of mind for many companies that are dealing with commodities and the risk of deforestation. Could you talk about how your technology helps with this challenge and what the challenge actually is for companies with this pending legislation?
Yeah, sure. So in a nutshell, not here to talk about EUDR, but in a nutshell, the requirements of EUDR is that anyone importing or indeed exporting from Europe is going to have to report on the product that they're bringing in or they're sending out around its point of origin, so geolocation. They have to be able to pinpoint all the source materials, where they've come from from a geolocation perspective, as well as detail around the legality of it in the jurisdiction it's come from, and then their due diligence process. And this isn't a yearly report thing. They have to do this on every single shipment. So when we talk about scale, for some organizations, big organizations, you're talking about thousands per day, and having to submit a report to the European Union. It was interesting because initially they said they wouldn't be providing an API for the report to go to their system until 2028. But there was so much fuss from the industry that's just not going to scale, that they will have it ready by the end of this year in time for enforcement. So there's a sheer scale of the problem there in terms of collecting that data, organising that data, submitting that data. And whenever you have these scale problems, and Ritu touched on this earlier, the biggest challenge actually comes to the small guy. The guy that doesn't have all the resources to be able to throw at this. They're talking about having to, where they've got one, maybe two compliance and sustainability staff, talking about having to triple, quadruple the size of the staff to be able to deal with that. And that's just for some of these smaller organizations impossible. And so that's where tech can really help those small organizations not only survive, but also compete. It makes them very much easier to deal with the large customers, because the customer's going to be asking for this data and they'll be able to provide it. So it really, you talked about in your introduction about making things equitable. I think this is where technology can help the small guy play along with the big guys as well. So that's where we see, and we're very, very keen in enabling the small guy to participate in these markets and access these markets as well.
Exactly. I'm sure your technology is available for a very low price at these smaller businesses. But how do you manage that complexity of not just the suppliers, but they'll have some confidential information about who their clients are, or maybe the makeup, the constituent parts of their product. So you want to be able to share the information for the carbon footprinting or the digital passports, but I don't want to give away who my suppliers are because that's my secret sauce. How would you manage that, David?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the biggest challenges because the regulation is actually being pretty demanding about a bit how much you reveal about who is in your supply chain. So there is an element of supply chains having to reconcile themselves to this fact. But we also recognise that, hang on a sec, there is a lot of information that they don't want to share. So for example, we developed technology where you might have a document that contains quite commercially sensitive information, such as the details of a contract. And so can they redact that, but still pass the redacted document on, and downstream they still be able to verify that what they're looking at is the original document, even with the redacted parts. And so we've developed technology that allows people to do that kind of exercise, and for that document still to be valid downstream for due diligence purposes. So yeah, we're always aware, and it's one of the biggest barriers to adoption from suppliers is that fear of being going around them because they happen to know them. But I think we're moving, and we have seen that change. There is a movement to a recognition that, hang on a sec, these problems need the whole industry to work together and to act on. And so there is a slow opening up of people to realise that, hang on, they need to share at least some data.
And that's a very relevant point, John, that you made, that suppliers are very, very skeptical that a number of these disclosures and the level of detail at which they currently are, there is, a lot of people think that, you could reverse engineer a lot of commercially sensitive information about a process. So if you're sharing carbon footprint about your scope 1, 2, and 3, it needs to include, it needs to have a fairly good understanding of, what goes in there, what's the process. So in a way, many times your commercially sensitive margins could be figured out as well. So that's one of the very strong resistance or hesitance from people to share data at that level. And the conundrum here is and people want the data to be very well assured as well. So it's like, the first part is, do you share the data? How do you trust it? And if you trust it, if there's a breakdown available beyond the first level of metric itself, and the moment you share that breakdown, it surfaces a number of things that you didn't want to exchange, right? So that's the the struggle of how do you balance assurance with the level of disclosure that's fit for purpose for a number of these areas. So,
just on that point, do you think that the regulation of carbon calculation and management, do you think that's keeping pace with some of these other regulations that are driving deeper and deeper requirements into the supply chain? So we have the Greenhouse Gas Accounting Protocol. It's kind of a global protocol for how this is all calculated, but companies that provide that third-party independence are not regulated in the same way that the financial institutions may regulate your calculation of EBITDA or your GAAP accounting standards. So do you feel there needs to be more regulation to provide that confidence, or do you think it's at a point where actually what we've got is good enough for us to get that view for our supply chain?
That's not my area of expertise, as in, what we need from a regulation perspective. But generally speaking, I think this is in an early stage of, this is in a nascent stage right now. Everyone is trying to figure out what the question is, how do we answer the question, and what's the best here. And of course, regulations always have a role to play in standardizing what gets reported so that everyone is using the same cuts, everyone is using the same first basis principles there to do it. And probably some of the work that might come through IASB and some of the other standards that are coming will help us in doing it. CSRD and ESRS particularly, now they're forcing some of these metrics to be included in annual reports, and what it would mean is you need to have the same set of controls on these metrics that you had for financial reporting. So I'm pretty sure this will help bring a lot more vigor to the numbers, to the reporting process, and through that, over a few years, we'll have a much more robust process.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the really powerful thing about the regulation, especially the pace of that change in Europe, has been how much more data is available to start to make decisions and to understand the full range of climate, sustainability, wider ESG kind of initiatives that need to be put in place. But a lot of the discussion around tech is then, because of those regulations, stays around that kind of measure and monitor side of sustainability. And actually to drive change, you need to go from measure and monitor into mitigate. And the really powerful thing about the collection of that data is that it then allows you to not have let's say positive climate outcomes as a byproduct of a cost-saving initiative around like getting better supply chain forecasting or things like that, which can clearly help reduce your carbon footprint. But it like a few years ago, it wasn't the source of that change. It was kind of a positive outcome that in many cases was missed or not fully measured. Now, in many of these big companies, more of that data is more readily available. It gives a much better kind of business and climate or business and sustainability matrix to go after those initiatives which are going to support costs, support the way a business makes money, but also make sure that they're doing it in a way that targets and brings a sustainable positive impact to the work they do as well. And that's been a really powerful thing around the regulation. The regulation's clearly getting more and more complex as well, which needs tech solutions to help manage that complexity and ensure the data's in place. But I think one of the big drivers of tech for good can be moving from measure and monitor into mitigate and making sure that the mitigation is happening at the most impactful areas of the business.
It's interesting that we're getting excited about regulation driving the adoption of technology, and without that adoption, it's very difficult to scale, not just to be able to pick up supply chains for large corporates like Unilever, but how smaller businesses can access the technology at a price point they can afford. But the technology itself can come under criticism for, the cost to carbon of storage and processing. There's a lot of information in the news about Gen AI and the exponential growth of just the data centers and the power consumption. Matt, perhaps you'd like to talk about that?
Yeah, so, Ecometrics is ultimately a service company. Our scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions are, I think, less than 5% of our entire carbon footprint. And we measure our carbon footprint accurately. The sources that we use to measure that are growing every year. We've done a kind of full audit every year for the last 3 years, at least, especially since we've had our dedicated head of sustainability in her role in the company as well. But yeah, scope 3 is 95% of our emissions, and that's a lot of that is through the data centers that we use for processing the algorithms and things like that. So one of the things that we've done to monitor and look to mitigate that impact is that we've developed just a little code snippet that sits in every Python notebook, in every algorithm, in every line of code, module of code that we run, that helps us track the CO2 emissions of that notebook or that code or that algorithm running. It feeds into a dashboard that everyone in the company has access to. We can tag it by client, by project, by initiative. And one of the important things that we've done with that data is that we've tested different configurations of cloud, cluster, and compute to basically say, how do we trade off between the absolute performance of an algorithm, like how quickly it runs and how accurately, the accuracy is something different, let's say how quickly it runs, and what's the carbon intensity that leads to that. And actually, is there a different configuration of that cloud compute that can lower the carbon footprint without negatively affecting the performance of that? So that's just one area where we're looking within our own operations to kind of mitigate the impact of that. And then clearly when we're using things like Gen AI applications, we're focusing on the less carbon intensive route to Gen AI. And so the most intensive is using Midjourney to create your lots of pretty pictures or creating videos is by far and away the most carbon intensive form of Gen AI call that you can make. And so a lot of what we're doing is not producing images and videos. We're parsing images and videos and things that companies are providing and ultimately focusing on the text output as well, and trying to again just stay in the less carbon intensive sides of the outcome of tech as well.
Thank you. David, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because one of the biggest criticisms on blockchain has been the inefficiency in the energy usage, and certainly in certain types of blockchain technology, that's a serious problem. We had to make very deliberate decisions to avoid such a thing, and so had to made technology choices that wouldn't result in that kind of outcome. Like with many things, things are a trade-off. So there's the reality is if we look in the space we're in, when you're talking about international trade and the billions of documents, printed documents that are produced and distributed through the supply chain, and you're kind of like, well, surely going digital is going to help there. But even when going digital, if you think about the fact that the same document being passed through the supply chain could well be sitting on 10 plus servers around the world, and this is where data platforms like what we are creating, where you store it once but multiple organizations can access that, you can find efficiency gains there. But everything's a trade-off. Somewhere you're saving, but there is a cost to it as well. So it's about making sure you always keep, like Matt was saying, you're always keeping your eye on, well, where can we bring those efficiencies? Where can we avoid the duplication and the unnecessary waste? So that's what we do.
And very similar that, yesterday we had a internal Unilever session on AI and sustainability. What does it mean? So we had both threads, like, what's the use of AI for sustainability? And we have some very good use cases that, how do you detect deforestation in nearly real time and connect to your supply chain, detecting forest fires, biodiversity loss, things as such. And then to your point that, I've been researching on the environmental impact of AI in general. And if you look at a data center, a typical data center has the same power footprint as 50,000 homes and a water footprint of approximately 25,000 to around 35,000 houses. So a data center is in a way equivalent to a mid-sized city. And particularly with the Gen AI use cases, the International Agency for Energy, they came up with the paper recently, and it was like in 2022, data centers consume the same amount of energy as France as a country, and by 2026, that's expected to double up. So, we need to be mindful of the AI use cases that we have, and depending upon the different Gen AI use cases, the energy intensity is much more different. And there is a research paper that was saying that, Matt, like you said, that if you create a generative AI image, it takes the same amount of energy as charging your phone once. So, and that varies so differently with something like, text parsing or summarizing, which is much more smaller. So we need to be mindful of how we use Gen AI as well.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I'd just like to open up to the floor to see if there are any related questions. If we have somebody who can walk around with a mic. We've got a lady in the second row here with a hand up. Shall I give my mic?
Hi, thank you so much. It was a really interesting talk to understand about technology, because I work on the technology side, and it's always interesting to find the balance of like the regulations coming out, the sustainability people wanting to implement it, and then the other side of technology being able to meet it. One of my questions is so many regulations coming out, and there's a lot of technology available. From the technology perspective, how do you, and it was one of the talks that people spoke about, like this permafrost, how do you manage the relationship of being able to getting the funding to be able to purchase this technology to provide the support, but then also in a sense with the technology from a financial perspective, also managing the challenges of the business being commercial to be able to support the regulations, because there's so much change, so much technology coming in. How can you provide good funding for technology solutions that will last, and then also be able to keep up with the sustainability regulations that are coming in?
Thank you so much.
I can take a first stab at answering that question, and you're right. So if you look at the current landscape, for every piece of regulation, there is bespoke technology being sold. So this is a UDR solution, this is a ESRS solution, this is a solution for CBAM. But I think where we've been slightly lucky as Unilever is, since we have been on this journey for the last 10, 15 years, we know the key jobs to be done. And if you look at the key regulation, the key jobs to be done are fairly similar. They might be asking about a different metric, but the job to be done is the same. So what's the key job to be done is how do you collect the information from your supplier? That is one of the biggest key jobs to be done. And in that exchange with the supplier, you need to ask the question about carbon, water, waste, biodiversity, because all of that is scope 3. And scope 3 is not just a carbon point. It's about what any environmental metric, you will have to divide that into scope 1, 2, and 3. And getting that information from the supplier is the biggest challenge. And that is not a company-specific challenge. That generically is an industry challenge. So if you're in FMCG, cars, manufacturing, it will have its own nuance, and the industry can coalesce around those nuances to solve that problem. And to your point, it's like, do we need technologies or do we need ecosystems? I think that's the balance we would need to have. And one more point around it is the regulation itself is so nascent. It's expected to evolve as well. So what you deploy today, you will have to keep rebuilding or adapting as well. So we need to be mindful of, do we need to buy everything right now? Because the landscape itself is not mature. So I have a role of an enterprise architect, and we say that we need a destination architecture, but at this point of time, I don't think the industry is ready to deploy the destination architecture right now, because everything is so moving, and it can happen perhaps by 2030. But right now, you define the process. That's the most important part. And the technology that helps deliver that process will follow. There will be a number of iterations, a number of churn in people who provide that. But I think that would be my response to your question as to how do we address technology and investments to technology as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritu. David?
Yeah. So just to absolutely add to that, so I've come from the financial industry that through regulation has been forced to do quite a lot to digitize. And one of the things that the industry kind of recognized was this need for common languages in the various business lines at a technology level. How do we actually exchange the information? What are the protocols? What are the standards? What is the language that we need to do? Now, they made some mistakes along the way. The technologies that were developed to do it were inaccessible. So anything that needs to be developed needs to be, at worst, commoditized, so it's not expensive for anyone to use. At best, I think it should be commons to enable people the accessibility of that technology to any organization of any size. But there's a real maturing that needs to happen in the organizations around technology and understanding what we need it to do as an industry, not just as in our silos within different organizations. What do we need it to do? And then how do the industries set themselves up to enable that to happen? I love what you just said about a destination. That doesn't happen overnight, but we need these big organizations getting together, talking about, right, as an industry, what do we need tech to do? Where do we want to get to? And then just start that journey. That's what the financial industry has had to do. Yes, it's got lots of criticisms, but they've actually done some things pretty well. And so we can learn from industries like that as to how can we bring that across other industries as well.
You just missed one phrase, interoperable as well.
Yeah.
So that's
the whole
super critical as well, that, how do we ensure that these ecosystems are interoperable? Otherwise, it's like, your debit card, you can go into any bank and withdraw money. And that's the paradigm that, this side of sustainability reporting needs to have as well.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Matt?
Maybe just from our experience in terms of cost, and I'll finish the thought on flexibility, because I think that's really important. And in the type of solutions we look to deploy, we're really not fixing a product in mind in terms of like we're not building CSRD platforms or products that deliver the final reporting. It's an assistant to help the people that will deliver the final thing. So as the regulations and reporting changes, then we just retrain the assistant to adapt to the new changes. And EUDR was mentioned earlier. It comes into effect from December 23 to December 24, right? Sorry.
That's a relief.
Yeah. December 24. And that's something we'll need to train the assistant on as well to bring that into play. So flexibility is really important in this space and as it grows. I think from a cost side, for sure, if you're a small supplier in a space and you're looking to fund that, then that can be an issue. I think this is where the role of kind of forward-looking or leading companies in the space are the companies like Unilever that are really putting money behind sustainability and showing it as more than a greenwashing promise, but as something where they're actually putting investment behind it is really important. And that supplier assistant I talked about before is the suppliers don't pay for that. Like ultimately, it's the likes of Unilever. Like we've deployed it with a luxury fashion house and with an FMCG, like a multinational FMCG. They fund both of those, and it's a tool to enable their entire supply chain to mature, to upskill, and to provide them with more accurate information and data. So I think in this stage of the maturity and development of the sustainability space, it really is still part of the role of those like leading companies to enable that wider ecosystem of partners, suppliers, and people to upskill and mature themselves, where it can be a financial burden for smaller companies that are still just looking to make ends meet in a difficult economic environment as well.
Indeed. Thank you, Matt. Does that answer your question? Super, thumbs up. Next question. Third row back, gentlemen. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Just wondering about ethics and governance on AI and next-gen AI and the tools you're developing. How do you monitor that?
Thank you. I think that's a question for
Matt.
Matt.
So, AI is a very wide space. I think the ethics of how you use AI and making sure that it's being used for good and in a good way is really important. So we have a dedicated role in Ecometrics who's our head of responsible AI. So again, we have a head of sustainability, we have a head of responsible AI who really works with our clients and to promote internally within our teams the best practices to use AI responsibly. Gen AI itself has a bad rap in a lot of places for negative economic consequences of people losing roles because it's replacing voice synthesis and things like that, and voiceover actors having difficulty in some cases to get work. I think we focus on those positive applications of AI where it can have a role for good, and steer away from those where it's destructive to industry, to roles, and really focus on basically supporting the humans to their role effectively. So in this space of sustainability reporting, if we're I think we're measuring for the FMCG that we're working with like an 80% reduction in the time it takes them to fill their regulatory requirements through the assistant. And that's time that those sustainability teams can be focusing on working with the business to actually mitigate and reduce impact rather than just be filling out the regulations.
Thank you, Matt. David?
Just a little thing to add, because we are looking to bring in AI as well. We are bringing in AI as well. I love the term you use anyway, assistant. I think that's a great way to look at AI. And this is where I think regulation plays a part as well, because ultimately you're not going to be able to blame your AI if you made the wrong decision. So EUDR comes with potential criminal conviction consequences, and the defence is not going to be, well, the AI told me it was fine. And so we make that very, very, very clear with our clients. Look, you can use it as an assistant. It can help you understand what you're looking at. It cannot make your decisions. And I think these are really important lines to draw around AI as in terms of expectation. What are you expecting from the AI? If you're expecting it to make decisions, then you're expecting the wrong thing. If you're expecting it to help you as an assistant, then you'll have positive results. So these are some things to consider.
Super,
similarly, on our side as well, as a large company, we have hundreds of AI use cases, and since the start of this journey, perhaps we were also one of the first companies to look at the ethical side of AI, and also from an AI assurance perspective. So we have a responsible AI policy through which we look at all of the possible use cases that, how do we assure the AI process in terms of data governance, the quality of the data, the bias of the models themselves. We have a very robust process. Similarly, we, as one of our principles, we want to ensure that there's always a human in the loop. David, to your point that, it is playing an assistance role and not having the AI make the decision itself. So, very good question, and something that, we very focused on, that, we just don't use AI, but we use AI responsibly. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, sir? Thank you. Just time for one more, perhaps, on the front row. Thank you.
I'm just interested to hear if you have any other tech considerations around any other dimensions of sustainability. So we've talked about reporting a lot most of the time, just to know if you're using tech in any other aspects of sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, great question. Ritu, do you want to start with that?
And one dimension of sustainability is tech helps with sustainability, but how do we ensure tech is the most sustainable as well? So we've been working very actively to look at, within the tech ecosystem itself, how do we ensure that the tech that is delivering sustainability and other objectives has the lowest environmental footprint. So we're working actively on principles that does not lead to a proliferation of technology without an understanding of the environmental footprint. So that's one area where we are applying ourselves very diligently.
I've got a practical example. So in dealing with the EUDR, and one of the requirements is to know that there's no deforestation happening at that geolocation, and this is one area where it's using AI again, as well as some other techniques, but actually analysing satellite footage for deforestation. So that's somewhere where it's not reporting somewhere, but it's actually it is helping you understand what you're looking at. And I think for organisations, so again, I'm back at the small company who's got one due diligence manager. That's the sort of tool that helps them make a decision. They can look at that and say, okay, it's telling me about that particular geolocation. It's saying it's a low chance of deforestation. I can make a decision with more confidence because I'm not an expert at looking at satellite imagery. So that's a real practical example of tech helping someone.
So I think from my side, maybe two different cases just to raise. I think one is we've talked about sustainability from the regulation, but sustainability from the finance perspective is becoming more like a bigger and bigger topic as well. And investment banks, private equity, the whole kind of funding of the ecosystem, the business ecosystem is really critical. And it's quite difficult for them sometimes to get the information on companies around their sustainability initiatives and really funding kind of greener companies versus those that are not. So that's where tech can play a really interesting role at scale in terms of estimating and modelling out, not necessarily through regulatory reporting, but through just estimates based on, again, what companies are saying that their actions are, what kind of sector that they sit in. So I think it's just over 80,000 companies that we've kind of run this AI-led estimate for in support of kind of the financial industry and making sure that they're able to back and support greener initiatives or greener companies versus those that are the most heavily negative for the environment. Maybe the second is when it comes to that mitigate is, again, using technology to really bridge that, to avoid the conflict between business outcome and sustainable outcome as well, because that's a really tight kind of divide to try and walk, and to find those solutions that are good for business but also good for sustainable outcomes is really important. Again, one of the things that we have in that place is a forecasting solution in the magazine publishing space. So down to the point of sale that they're distributing to, it's forecasting and making sure that they have more accurate predictions around what's going to be sold out, so that they maximize sell-through, but they're reducing the number of magazines they're printing. It's better for their margin, but it's also better for their supply, for their CO2 emissions as well, because they're producing less in the first place. And so that kind of finding those areas of business and sustainable kind of win where they go hand in hand is I think one of the really important ways that tech can play a role in actually mitigating and reducing the overall climate footprint.
I
Thank you,
just
Matt.
have one more example for you.
Just
I
quickly
missed
then,
it out is accessibility. So one of the biggest areas as Unilever we are trying to apply technology is how do we make technology accessible by design for people who have different abilities, and how do we ensure everyone has the same experience irrespective of the different capabilities that we have. So we're working very actively on that.
Super, thanks Ritu. Did that answer your question? Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think it's time to start wrap up and just summarise where we've gone to on this discussion. So we talked initially around carbon measurement and management, monitoring in the supply chain, some with tens of thousands of suppliers, and how technology can access the data and bring it together in a coherent or an interoperable way. But also as an enabler to make decisions. So we heard about technology being an assistant, supporting the decision making, being able to offer the scale for low cost or no cost solutions for SMEs and smaller businesses in that, but really being able to provide us with that solution that doesn't just help the larger corporates, but some of the smaller suppliers in what's increasingly becoming more and more regulated environment for technology providers and the buyers of the technology. So I'd just like to thank the panel, Ritu from Unilever, David from IOV42 and Matt from Ecometric. Thank you so much for coming and joining the discussion. And thank you all for coming and listening to the discussion, and hopefully this will give you a chance to innovate and inspire your own businesses to embrace technology as an enabler for good. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.